Okay, hi guys. So I just wanted to wrap up with some molecules. So macromolecules means big molecules, and again, molecules just means two or more atoms working together to perform a similar function or to create a product together. So big is things like lipids, and so that is fat. And some real life examples of that would be like butter, bacon grease, lard if you've ever like made refried beans that are traditional and contain lard. What other things could we say? So waxes also repel water, so we can imagine like a succulent leaf, they're kind of waxy, or duck's wings. And then some liquid at room temperature things like vegetable oil, walnut oil, olive oil, all those oils are also lipids. So the property of lipids is that it does not get along with water at all. So they're all hydrophobic, or water repelling, water fearing, and I'm just going to give you some examples, and you can start to recognize the pattern of what makes a lipid. So just to get us started, H, O, and C were hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon. And the reason that they're put in that order is because those are the number of bonds it makes. So when we talk about bonds, you can draw all these atoms out with all of their electrons, and you can see why they would make that number of bonds in particular to fill their outer shell and have their full octet, or hydrogen just needs two because it only has the one ring. So HONC, this one is the only one that the lipids do not contain. So they all contain C's, O's, and H's, or however you want to phrase that. But I'll just draw one chain here. So we have a long carbon chain. So, and all of these carbons are sharing those electrons equally between themselves. So a non-polar covalent bond. And usually at one end, we'll have what they call a methyl group. So this is a methyl functional group, and that is CH3, if we want to write it that way, and it looks just like that. So the rest of the carbon chain, we will just have hydrogens off of. So we can draw those in. You could just leave them like that, or you could physically draw in all those hydrogens. Okay. So let's draw one last carbon over here, and I'm going to label that a carboxyl group. So it's another functional group, and that is a COOH. So oxygen needed two bonds off of it, so we have an O there that bonds with the C, and it's also going to bond with a hydrogen. So we'll have COH down here. And so if we count, the oxygen then has two bonds off of it. And carbon needed 4. So then we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to have a double bond down here. So that's how we make the COOH. So this carboxyl group down here, however you wanted to draw it, is COOH. And that is typical in all these fatty acids. So you could call this a lipid, you could call it a fatty acid chain. You can also call it a saturated fat. So a saturated fat is going to be solid at room temperature because this molecule is long and straight, and they just lay right on top of each other, sort of like bricks laying nice and solid together. So when we say saturated, the way to remember that is that it's saturated with hydrogens. So there's no missing hydrogens here. So we're going to now draw an unsaturated fatty acid. And all we're going to do is create a double bond somewhere. So we just have to put in at least one for this to become, I'm just going to draw that one that way. And we'll draw this one. See. Okay, so we have our carboxyl group over here. We have our methyl group still, but then we put in this double bond. So that double bond takes one of the carbon bonds away from the ability to bond with hydrogen. So now we can only have one hydrogen off of this and one hydrogen over here. So this double bond actually puts a bend or a kink in the molecule. So these can no longer lay flat on top of each other. They are sort of all juxtaposed and they can't lay flat, so they are liquid at room temperature. Okay, so we still have all these other hydrogen bonds just like normal. So this would be an unsaturated fat because it is not saturated with hydrogens anymore. So the one thing that I will say is, like, sometimes if you look at your vegetable oil, you'll see like hydrogenated oil or something like that. They do that to make it preserve longer and not be reactive to oxidation or reactions with the air. So you can have hydrogenated oils on the shelf a lot longer without it going rancid. So that's why they do it. But it's not healthy for you. So when you falsely make an unsaturated fat rehydrogenated with these hydrogens, then you are changing the way it behaves in the body. So the naturally occurring unsaturated fats are considered very healthy, but we also need some saturated fats in our diet, just a lower amount. So unsaturated fats that are healthy, I know a lot of people talk about olive oil, and right now, like coconut oil is sort of all the rage. So it's actually a medium fat fatty acid chain instead of a long fatty acid chain, but it kind of acts as an unsaturated fat even though it is solid at room temperature. So that's a really interesting way that it behaves in the body. So all of these fatty acids are going to be just not going to get along with water. They're all going to be hydrophobic and repel water. So I would encourage you to look up images of triglycerides and steroids, anything cholesterol based, so you can kind of get an idea there. But all of your steroids like estrogen and testosterone, and there's estradiol and progesterone, like they all kind of have the same basic cholesterol shape. I am not a good drawer, so I won't do that, but I will let you Google those to get a broader idea. So you'll have a giant E shape with fatty acid chains off of that giant E. Steroids, you'll have like a beehive shape inside there. But again, like all of these will have the same properties where you're going to have C's, O's, and H's. And hopefully we understand that like all those bonds, so like if you go back here to our long fatty acid chain, all of these bonds contain an immense amount of energy. So fat is used as energy storage. So it's also useful to not always get along with water. So if we want to protect something from a chemical reaction or, keep it around for a while, that's exactly what we do. We're going to store it inside of a fatty acid or put it away in adipose tissue, fat cells. And a lot of times we can take a toxin or something like that and just package it up away from reactions with water so that it's not poisoning us. So again, lipids essential, they're not evil, but because they contain so much energy, they actually contain 9 calories per gram as opposed to 4 when we are looking at carbohydrates. So our second molecule is carbohydrates, and carbon and water is pretty much what that says. So carbs aren't bad either, but they contain 4 calories or kilocalories per gram as opposed to 9. So these are going to make bonds, and I'm just going to show a generic fructose. You can look up all of the side appendages, but I just want to kind of show this general shape. This is a carbon ring. If you wanted to draw all those carbons in, you could. So it's a carbon ring with an oxygen. So the oxygen looks kind of like a diamond ring. So you can think of a ring if you would like, if that makes it helpful. If we have a traditional glucose molecule, you'll have another carbon ring with, instead of 5 over here, you're going to have 6. And you can have glucose in that carbon ring. So there will be other things that are off of it, so you are going to also have C's, O's, and H's. And I can actually change the screen to Google. So we're going to go back here and just look up the different chemicals that we might have. So I said Google triglycerides, and we could just look up triglycerides and then click on Google Images. And I want you guys to do this for all of them. So triglycerides would look here. If you want to draw out the structures, it would still be that long fatty acid chain. Over here, you can see the carboxyl groups at the end with a glycerol tail or backbone. So there you have saturated fatty acid, and an unsaturated fatty acid, all on this huge molecule. So that's the triglycerides. We said cholesterol, and there's the base structure for cholesterol. So again, these are carbon rings, so they just don't draw in the carbons, but then you have hydrogen sticking off of it. So, and there's just that one O over here. So fats have much less oxygen in proportion, but cholesterol is structurally still a lipid with COs and H's, sorry. You want to type in testosterone, and boom. So again, it's like, it's quite similar to just the basic cholesterol looking, but there's some side chain differences. And that's all that changes for estrogen as well. So it's just the side chains are slightly differently structured, but cholesterol is the base. So that's interesting because our cell membranes are made up of lipids, so phospholipid bilayer, and the lipid layer is what actually keeps the impermeability. When I said you wanted to kind of encase something in a lipid to keep it from reacting with water, that lipid barrier is what makes our cells stay our cells and not just merge with all the water around it. But cholesterol would be a fat that could go in through a cell. So sex hormones are very powerful because they can travel right through the cell membrane, which is fascinating. But there's not a whole lot of difference between estrogen and testosterone as far as chemistry goes. They're both lipid-based or cholesterol-based. Okay, so now we are typing in carbohydrates, and we're going to get a whole bunch of these carbon rings with that oxygen in there. So you can have monosaccharides. So another word for carbohydrate is saccharide. And saccharides are sweet. So if you've ever heard that term saccharine sweet, you're basically sugary sweet, maybe a little too nice. But here we have the glucose molecule with that oxygen, but the carbons are drawn in. But here you have the monosaccharides, so you have just one. You can have a disaccharide with 2, or you can have a polysaccharide with many, all linked together. So I would look those up in your textbook, look for examples, but the difference between a cholesterol is that there is no oxygen in that ring at all. And to make it a sugar, you are going to have that oxygen, or it makes it look like a diamond ring. So that is the primary difference. But again, sugar is used for energy, so COs and H's used for energy, they're 4 calories per gram as opposed to 9, but they are still getting along with water. So if you imagine making a big old jug of Kool-Aid, that sugar, you put a whole cup in if you do it following the directions, which is a lot of sugar, but you eventually can stir it enough to get that sugar to absorb in solution. So I just want to make sure that we're keeping it straight. We have sodium chloride or table salt gets along with water. We have lipids that do not get along with water. So we want to make sure that we're keeping sort of our substances aligned. So this means that carbohydrates do get along with water. It cannot pass directly through that membrane, which is the phospholipid bilayer. So that will be important as we're talking about cell transport and what can get into and out of a cell easily. Our next macromolecule kind of deserves a video of its own, so I'm going to do that video separately, but it is protein. And so proteins are going to have layers and layers of structure, and so we're going to go over that in our next video. But I want to point out that a protein is HONC. So HONC finally incorporates that nitrogen. So we have the full honk when we get to protein. So we'll do that video in just a moment.